Welcome everyone to Web Connections and Services in FME, tips and tricks to setting up and harnessing their full potential. To kick us off, we will go ahead and introduce our presenters. I'll pass the mic over to Jen to introduce herself.
Yeah, so I'm Jen. I am the team lead for Flow hosted support, anything cloud and containers, basically.
And my name's Matt, and I'm a technical support specialist with the FME Flow team.
And my name is Jenna, and I'm a technical support specialist for the Flow team, for the Form team. So we got everyone from each product, it seems. Just noticed.
Lovely. All right. So before I go through the agenda here briefly, I'll just get our presenters to turn off their webcams to save on some bandwidth for the remainder. We do have some upcoming demos here. So today we'll be going through an introduction to the webinar topic and Safe and FME for those who are newer. Then we'll be taking you through connecting to a web service and what you need there, building the definition, and then using the HTTPCaller for making API calls. We'll be showing you some real-world examples and sharing web connections, as well as troubleshooting your web service. And from there, we'll go on to conclusion and some resources to help you get started with next steps. And then we'll have some Q&A time to follow. If you have any questions throughout, please drop those in the questions tab on the bottom right. And keep letting us know where you're tuning in from, or leave any comments throughout under the chat tab. Share your reactions with us throughout with that react emoji button on the bottom middle. And then if you do have any audio issues or any video issues, please click the help button on the bottom left, and there's 4 simple steps there to troubleshoot. Love everyone testing out the emoji button. That's great. All right, and with that, I will hand things over to Matt for our introduction.
Great. We're going to kind of go through an introduction and help you gain a comprehensive understanding of what web connections are using FME and enhance your technical capabilities. So hopefully there'll be something for everyone in this webinar, from people who are brand new or to people who have used them before, and we can dive a little bit deeper. So most of our data now, or more of our data now, is living in web applications. So things like SharePoint, ArcGIS Online. Common frustrations people face with this topic are, how do I integrate with my web application? FME, as we'll talk about, has a bunch of web service templates and connections you can create, but we don't always have one for everything. So it is possible to create your own connection templates based on the vendor documentation for the web application you want to connect to. And there's also, you set up a connection, but it doesn't work, or you get connected and it's unreliable, keeps disconnecting. So we're here to help, and we're going to go through a lot of these scenarios today. So web connections in FME are really important. They're reusable, shareable, deployable, especially when paired with deployment parameters, which are new in FME 23, and we'll touch on briefly. They can be exchanged, and they let you connect to all kinds of different web applications out there. So before we get too deep into this, let's just talk a little bit about Safe and FME for those who might be brand new to our company and our products. This is the FME Enterprise Integration Platform. So FME Forum, that I suspect many of you are already familiar with. This was formerly FME Desktop, and this is where you'd author your data ETL workflows. And then once those are authored, you can publish them to FME Flow. This was previously FME Server, where you can do things like automate those workflows to run on schedule or trigger them in automations. And then we also have FME Flow Hosted, previously FME Cloud. And that is FME Flow hosted by us here at Safe. And so over the years, we responded to our customers' needs, and we now support over 400 different formats, standards, and applications. So we started with geospatial data and right through to location intelligence and IoT. Our goal is to enable you to use your data where, when, and how it's needed, regardless of its source. So since we have a lot of content to cover, let's get right into connecting to a web service, what you need to know. So I'll try and move through this fairly quick. We're just going to kind of go over some terms and concepts for those who are brand new to web services and connections. So what is a web connection? It is a safe and convenient way to store and reuse your connection parameters. secure named container to use in your workflows. You can use with all supported authentication protocols. You register with web services from FME form, and there's different types of web services, OAuth 2, token, and HTTP authentication, which would be kind of your typical username password authentication. We're going to focus on the first two types there, OAuth 2 and token, in this webinar, because that is what many popular web applications use now. So there are two parts here to the web connection. There's the underlying web service that gets defined in FME form. And you can see these in form if you go up to Tools, FME Options, Web Connections, and then click Manage Services. You'll see a big list. FME form ships with a bunch of templates for common web services. Here we're looking at one for Azure ArcGIS Online. So this has got, the web service has all the, the URLs and IDs and important stuff needed to make that connection. And then from that web service, you can create a web connection, one or many web connections using the web service. Some of the key components of a web service are the token. This is an alphanumeric string used to authenticate and identify an application to an API. And if you've never heard the term token before, you can kind of think of that as a username password. It's just another thing you can use to authenticate. A REST API is a set of constraints that allows the software to communicate with a defined protocol. So this is an interface, and in web services, REST APIs are what serve tokens. So a vendor like Azure would, and ArcGIS Online is going to have a URL that's an endpoint to one of the REST APIs where FME can go get those tokens to authenticate. JSON is JavaScript object notation, and this is the format most commonly used to pass data back and forth to web services REST APIs. And there are more components based on the type of web service, and we'll kind of cover those as we discuss token and OAuth 2 web services. Authentication is really important to discuss here, and what the difference is between authentication and authorization. So authentication verifies your identity before you can make a request. So you think about like a web application like Gmail, for example. If you can't log in, you can't do anything. That's you authenticating. If you do log in successfully and you've authenticated, you might not be authorized to do everything within the web application. There might be certain pages you can't view, for example. And so that's authorization. Some of the errors you might see when you start working with web services, or even beforehand, regarding authentication authorization are 401 errors. So this would be commonly no token provided in the request, or maybe a bad token was provided. You'll also see 403 errors. These are related to authorization. This means you're forbidden to access the resource. So you've authenticated okay, but the token's not authorized to access the resource requested. So when authenticating with FME, we support many HTTP authentication protocols. You have basic, this sends credentials unencrypted. And this is what probably a lot of you are using right now in your workflows if you're not using web connections yet. Digest, which is similar to basic, that sends credentials encrypted though. And Kerberos and NTLM are built for Windows. Kerberos is a little bit newer. And these use your Windows account of the user running the workspace. Even more ways to authenticate: API keys, user tokens, and OAuth 2. So again, we'll be focused on the last two bullets in the list there, instead of passing credentials back and forth like those first authentication protocols. So when talking about tokens, it's important to understand that they do expire. So a token served up from an app like SharePoint or ArcGIS Online is going to have a lifetime of 30 minutes or 2 hours. That's for security reasons, and those time limits are imposed by the web application serving the token, not FME. So when using a token to authenticate, FME will track when the current one expires and get a new one when it needs to. So if you've seen Star Trek: The Next Generation before, you know who this character at the bottom of the slide is. This is the fearless Commander Riker. Some people, like Jen, have not seen Star Trek, so I have to introduce him. And so on the left side here, we see probably where many of you are today, using credentials in your connections to authenticate using basic authentication. And Riker thinks that's just okay. Where we want to get to is happy Riker, where you're using a reusable web service and connection. So Riker thinks that's nice. And then the very nice is using deployment parameters, which are new to FME 23. And these are even more reusable and dynamic. So we'll touch on those briefly during the webinar as well. So laying the groundwork before we start creating some of these web connections and services. Before you go in and try and create one, it's good to see, can you access the web application you're building the web service for from FME Forum or the Flow machine? Because lockdown networks and firewalls often block communication. So just want to make sure you can get to that web app and log in even outside of FME. It's good to review the vendor's API documentation so you understand how to configure that web service. You want to review FME Forum documentation for the reader and writer you're going to be using the web connection for, because it'll provide more details on authentication requirements. And review articles in the FME community for step-by-step instructions on creating popular web connections like SharePoint and ArcGIS Online, Enterprise Portal. We have really detailed articles that go into step-by-step how to configure those, including how to set up the applications on the vendor side. So let's look at building a web service definition. So we'll look at a token web service first. This is one of the common web service types. The other is OAuth 2. Token web services are more simple than OAuth 2. You simply request the token from the web application by going to the REST API URL in the format the vendor wants you to, and then they're going to send you back a token with an expiry time. And when that token expires, FME will go back to that URL and get another one. And so these are created in, as we'll see shortly, these are created under FME options in web connections, web services. So the key components specific to token web services are the token generation REST API. Again, that tells FME how to make the request to get the token. The access token response. So we have to tell FME what the vendor is going to send back. So what is the name of the token key in the JSON, and what's the name of the expiry key it should expect back? And then once FME knows that, it needs to know how to use that token to make requests to the web application going forward to authenticate. So that is in the API call parameters section. And quite often it'll be a header format similar to what we see here. Authorization, this one is for FME Flow, so it's FME token, and then a placeholder for the token. So let's go through and just do a quick demo here to show building a token web service. And I'll just need a moment to share here. So we're going to go through and create a new web service and connection using Precisely. This is a web application that offers a bunch of services like geocoding. And we don't provide a template for this one currently in FME, a web service template. So the first thing to do is look at the vendor documentation. So we're taking a quick look there, jumping into FME Forum. And one of the things Precisely wants is to have credentials passed in a base 64 string. So that's what I've encoded here in FME. Requirements will be different for each vendor. And then it wants that base 64 value passed in the authorization header. So we're just kind of going through the steps here. And it's given us the URL that's going to serve up the token. And so we're going to use that information and go into FME options, web connections, manage services, and we're going to build a new web service using the vendor doc. So if I click the plus token service, and this will let us create a new token service that we can give a name. We'll call it Precisely. And here we'll see, as I showed on the slides, we got the token generation REST API. So I'm going to paste in the URL that is in Precisely's documentation. And let's just take another look at their doc. In the request body, they're expecting a grant type of client credentials. So we'll copy that and paste that in our request data here. And what else does precisely want? Right, so we need the base 64 value passed in the headers when we make a call to that API to get the token. So again, in our token generation REST API, we're going to expand headers, and we need to add another parameter here for authorization. And we're going to pass in our base 64 value. I'm just going to paste that in there. And now we have our REST token generation REST API call. We have to tell FME what it's going to expect back from the vendor. So we're going to look at their doc again and look at how the access token is returned. We see this is the JSON coming back, and we have the access token key. It's access underscore token, and then the expiry is expires in without an underscore. And so we need to provide those keys to FME so it knows what's coming back. So I'm going to paste in access token, and then we'll copy and paste expires in. And notice there's a bit of inconsistency in their naming. So that's another reason it's just important to carefully follow vendor documentation. However they've named things is what we have to tell FME. So now FME knows how to get the token, and we have to tell FME how to use that token to make an API call. So we're going to look at the documentation again, and we see precisely wants that token formatted like this: authorization, bearer, and then the access token. So in the API call parameters, we're going to have to change is defaulted and put the word bearer, space, and then we have a parameter for token. That's what the square brackets around there are. So I'm going to apply that. And let's test out this web service we've created. So I'm going to choose precisely now from the list that's available because I created the web service, and we'll give it a web connection name. We're going to create an instance here, and it looks like it was successful. If it wasn't able to connect, we get an error. So let's run an HTTPCaller. Jen's going to go more into this in her slides, but we're going to hit one of Precisely's geocoding endpoints and pass in the address for Safe Software here in Surrey, and see if it can give us back the coordinates. And for authentication, instead of hard coding this in HTTPCaller now or using basic authentication, we're going to use our new web connection. So this is a reusable object I could use if I have 10 HTTP callers all calling precisely. I can just reuse my web connection over and over. So if I run this, we see we got successful 200 code back. If I run right to the end, we'll see there's our point for our office in Surrey, British Columbia, Canada. So that's just a quick demo of how you can create a token web service and connection. Sorry, I did go through that pretty quick, but we just have a lot of content to cover today, so don't worry, we'll be reiterating some of this as we go. One thing I didn't do when I created that web service was parameterize it. So on this slide here, we're taking a look at the FME Flow web service that comes with FME. This is also a token web service. And you'll notice here that there's parameters that you can provide in your web service definition for the user creating the web connection to create. So in the case of Precisely, it didn't take a username password. It wanted that encoded string. But in the case of FME, we could use basic authentication to get the username and password, and then use that to go get the token from FME by hitting our token website URL. So this just shows you any parameters you define in the service will show up on the connection for a user creating connections, and those parameter values will fill in the areas, the placeholders where you see the square brackets on the web service. Okay, I think I've talked enough for now. I'll pass it to Jen.
Thanks, Matt. So I guess Matt already spoiled this section. I'm going to be taking us through an example with OAuth 2 connection this time. So this is based on a real scenario. So in 2018, way back on the FME community, we have an ideas forum where people can post ideas for features they want to see in FME. So this person wanted a Microsoft Teams connector transformer. So we already have a native Slack connector, which allows you to post messages to Slack And a lot of our customers do use Microsoft and do use Teams. So they wanted that functionality for their sort of like organizational chat tools. So then in 2021, finally went on to build this, and I'm going to walk you through that process. So before you decide to build anything like that, you've got to figure out if your application or service that you want to interact with, in this case, Microsoft Teams, does it have an API? And luckily for us, Microsoft does have an API, has a graph API, which is kind of like one big catch-all API for a lot of their services. The documentation actually that Microsoft puts out is really good, pretty comprehensive. So it's easy to go and find the documentation for the specific requests that you want to make. We also know that the Microsoft Graph API uses OAuth 2 authentication. And we know that FME allows us to build those web services and web connections. And Microsoft, again, their documentation is pretty good at walking through that process. So now that we're confident FME can handle all of this, we can start to build it. So Matt showed the setup, the web service setup screen or configuration screen for token. So this is just showing what kind of parameters and things you need to put into an OAuth 2 configuration. So I've color-coded the different sections in this dialog window for some of the key things that you need. So at least for Microsoft and their OAuth 2 connections, you need a client ID. This acts as public identifier for your application. So when FME goes to Microsoft, it will give Microsoft that client ID and it will know which application you're referring to. Client secret, which acts as a password between the client, which in this case is FME, and your service, which is Microsoft. This can be optional, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in the next slide. The redirect URI has to match between what is configured in FME and configured in the service. Otherwise, at least for Microsoft, if you try to authenticate, you'll get errors if they don't match. And this is so that Microsoft knows where to send sensitive information to. So quite often with OAuth, this auth flow, it will be tokens. And then the authorization URL. So this is where FME will go to get an authorization code from. So there are a few parts of this URL that you will need to configure when setting this up. And again, as Matt mentioned, kind of going through this fairly quickly. So if you want more information or you want to go through this at your own pace afterwards, there is an article on the community, which if you have the slides, that's hyperlinked at the bottom, or if you search for Microsoft Teams on the community, you should come across that article. So once you know what you need in FME, you can go into the Azure portal and get everything you need, basically. So again, I've color-coded this so you can see in the Azure portal, you'll create an app registration. And on that main overview page, you'll be able to see the client ID. It's right in front of you, copy and paste that, put it into FME. The client secret, if you need one. So some services will want you to have a client secret, some services won't. For Microsoft, they actually don't trust desktop applications to sort of send a client secret. They don't believe that it's secure enough to keep a client secret on a desktop machine. So for FME form, we don't send a client secrets. That's why the optional box was checked. But if you're publishing your web connections and workspaces to FME Flow, you will want a client secret for that, and you'll reconfigure the web service on Flow. So if you need a certificate or a secret, you can see on the left-hand side, that's where you'd go to get it. Your redirect URI you can get from the authentication tab on the left. That's where you'll choose what kind of app you want to configure. So if you're telling Microsoft it's a desktop app, if you're doing this for form, then it will give you a different redirect URI to if you're setting up a web app, so Flow. And then for FME Flow as well, you need to make sure that you're putting in the redirect URI, which will typically be your host name, which for some services has to be public, has to be configured for HTTPS, and it will have a different endpoint. So we'll have the FME OAuth endpoint, so the FME server can actually take the tokens the service is sending back and use them in your workspaces or jobs. So then I mentioned on the last slide the authorization URL, and there are a few things that make that up. So one of them will be the tenant ID, which you can see in the dark blue box. Depending on your tenancy, so if you're building a sort of web service with Microsoft, you'll get to choose when you create it if you want anybody to be able to use your application that you've defined. And you can see that here set as multiple organizations. That's known as multi-tenant. If you're setting it up as a single tenant, so only people who belong to your organization can use it, you'll need to make sure that you're putting that tenant ID in your authorization URL. But again, if you go to the article that's on the knowledge, you'll be able to find more details about that. And then one of the most important things too, as Matt was talking about authorization, you need to make sure FME is actually able to access the different services that you're interested in. So in this case, because we're interested in Microsoft Teams, we want to make sure that we give this app the right permissions. So the Microsoft Graph API documentation is great. So this is just a screenshot from their page on the request that you use to send a message to Teams, to put a message in a channel. So for each request, they give examples, they tell you what's needed. They also tell you what permissions are needed to be able to do that action. So you can see here the least privileged permission is the channel message.send. So that's one of the permissions that we need to make sure we give that app registration in the Azure portal. And again, if you weren't doing Teams, if you were doing something completely different with the Graph API, you would just go and look up what that request is, see what permissions they need, and then put those into your app registration in Azure instead. So on this slide, you can see I actually have the full endpoint to send a message to Microsoft Teams. And you can see that it actually needs a little bit more than just the message that you want to send. So you can see inside the squiggly brackets, the URL or the endpoint also needs the team ID and the channel ID. And I don't know about you, but when I've used Teams, I don't actually know the channel ID or the team ID that I'm in. You know them by name. So we're going to need to figure out what the team ID is, what the channel ID is before we can send a message. And we can do that in FME with multiple HTTP callers. We just have to make more requests to the Graph API. So again, just like on the last slide, I went and looked up what the request would be to figure out the team ID, what the request would be to do the channel ID. And then based on all of the requests that I know I need to make, I've collected all the permissions I need, which you can see here in the color-coded screenshot. So once you've put all of that together and you've built your web service, you've got a web connection, it works, you can authenticate no problem. You can test this out in a HTTP caller. So very similar to how Matt set his up with Precisely, just showing how Microsoft have given an example here, just sending a basic hello world message to a channel. You can see in the color-coded boxes where to put the method, the post, you set that in the HTTP caller, where the URL goes, and you can see that they've got their channel ID and team ID in that URL. The content type, the JSON body and the content there, hello world, that would be the message that gets posted to Microsoft Teams. And then I guess the whole point of this webinar, the bottom screenshot shows where I've set up my web connection, and I'm just putting that Microsoft Teams web connection. So I'm not having to put all my credentials, build that OAuth flow using a series of HTTP callers. That using authentication and a web connection makes it super easy. So as I mentioned, there's multiple steps to this process. We have to go and get a team ID, then a channel ID, and then we can actually send our message. So that's why here you can see there's 3 HTTP callers, each doing a different job. And then the first one will pass the team ID after it's been through the JSON fragmenter, which takes that JSON response from Microsoft, splits it up into different attributes. The tester is checking based on like a string to make sure I'm pulling the ID for the right team that I'm interested in, and the same for the channel. And then it's passing that team ID and channel ID to the HTTP caller on the right-hand side, so I can actually post a message to Teams. So this is what you'll see if you ever download the Microsoft Teams connector from FME Hub. If you went inside and edited that transformer, this is pretty much what you'll see. And then One thing that I did when building this is every single HTTP caller is using that Microsoft Teams web connection, but instead of setting up and going in and configuring every single HTTP caller, I set that up as a web connection user parameter. So on the main custom transformer interface, I only have to set that once, which you can see here, and that will put the same web connection on every HTTP caller, which just makes configuring it a little bit easier. And then if you ever want to do this, maybe not for Teams because we've already done it, but if there's a web service out there you want to build a connection for, and then maybe a custom transformer, don't forget that you can share this on the FME hub so more people can use it. So you can see here all of those parameters inside the series of transformers on the last slide, wrapped up, made a custom transformer, and then that's published up on FME hub. And as well, you can publish the web service definition. So maybe you just build a definition, you can share that on there as well. And you can see quite a few hundreds of people have actually downloaded that, which is pretty cool to see.
Yeah, so thanks, Jen and Matt. So they've run over some details and information on how to set up and configure your web service. So in this next section, let's talk to some real-world examples and where you might want to use web services and web connections in your FME workflow. So let's quickly go over some of the benefits. We've already touched on these, but let's just quickly go over some of these benefits of utilizing web services and web connections in your workspace. So web services really allow you to enable that remote data access, and it allows for interoperability and a cost-efficient way to really scale these solutions. It also ensures the standardized protocols that you use. It helps to continue real-time updates and more security as well. And the integration really helps you create these feature-rich apps just without having to build them from scratch as well. There's a lot of benefits that can come with using web services to build your solutions. Just to shout out some popular web services that our users use in FME, there's SharePoint, a really big one, CityWorks, Azure, ArcGIS Online is also a big one, Salesforce, and we can't forget FME Flow to complete that whole platform experience. And using the methods that Jen and Matt have gone over, the possibilities here can really be endless depending on how you want to configure and create a new web service. So since the template and option is there, it's a good chance to explore what web services you might want to integrate into your workspace, to your workflow. So we'll move on to the demo. In my demo, I'm going to be going over three unique ways you could use SharePoint. I'll be using SharePoint as my example web service, and I'll go over kind of three unique ways, I guess, you could use SharePoint in your workspace. So I'll just show you the site that I'm connecting to right now. I've just created this site, has a few documents in here just for demo purposes. So you can connect to your SharePoint sites using the SharePoint Online connector. If you're trying to read from the SharePoint lists, we do have a separate reader called the SharePoint list reader and writer, and that might utilize a different web service. But for this demo, I'm going to be using the SharePoint Online connector. So in this first scenario here, I want to download and migrate data that exists from SharePoint, and I want to move it to ArcGIS Online. So to start this, I've plopped down a creator to kick off my workflow for the SharePoint Online connector. And in here, I've selected the web service and web connection that I've configured correctly. We have a few actions in here that we can select. For this section, I'm selecting download so that I can download the file that exists on SharePoint, on my SharePoint site to my local directory before I upload it. And I can set that here in my destination. So I've set it to save here. So when that runs, what it's going to do is it's going to output the file path of where that's been downloaded. And I'm going to plop down a feature reader next. And in my feature reader, I've set the data set to be the download path. So it'll grab the path and read it as a shapefile. Once that reads in, I can see the shapefile preview in my graphics view here. So I just have a few water lines in an area. And I can write that out to ArcGIS Online like you could do any other format, really. So that's my first example there. In the second example, we're going to talk about how you could clean up your existing documents in SharePoint. So I'm just going to bring up my site here again. I have a few CSVs, an Excel file, and a zip file here. But let's say I want to get rid of all CSVs in here. So again, I've plopped down a creator to start off the SharePoint Online Connector. And this time in the actions, I've selected the list action, which will list kind of the metadata of your SharePoint site. Selected my site and path. And what that shows you is the name, full path of all the contents, and the ID. So I want to select everything that ends in a CSV. So I've put down a tester and made it so that it'll filter or test for everything where the name ends in .csv. So let's run that. So it looks like there's 5 CSVs in here that I want to get rid of. So I'm going to put down another SharePoint Online Connector, and this time set the action to delete. And I want to delete everything that has that path. So in the path, this time, instead of manually selecting what file I want, I've set the user parameter to be full path, which will read the full path that came out from the tester here. So if I run this, it'll delete all the CSVs in my site. While I let that run, maybe you can check back on it, and I'll just reload that. And you can see all CSVs have been deleted. So this is a good way to maybe, if you want to maintain, bulk maintain your files on your SharePoint site, this is a great method to use, the online connector. This next method is just a good way to know, just a method you could use, not just limited to the SharePoint Online Connector, but other web services in general. If you didn't know already, you could use a web connection in a reader directly. So for example, I want to, let's say, read in an Excel file. And this works for many formats. If you go to the drop-down triangle here in data sets, you have the option to select a file from the web. And in here, SharePoint is an option, but so is Dropbox, FME Flow, Google Drive. And you can also just specify a URL if you're using a web service or a web app service. So if I click the SharePoint option here, it'll show a similar window to the SharePoint Online Connector. You can select an account, the site you're interested in, and also the library that you're interested in. So I've already done that here. So I've read in an Excel file that exists on my site here. Now, if I read that in, it's going to read in just like how you have the Excel file locally on your directory. The only limitation with this method is you don't get all the actions from the SharePoint Online Connector since you're utilizing their API there in the back, but this is just reading in a file as if it were local to you. So I've just gone through some data wrangling processes that I've just minimized here since that's not the main part of our demo here today. And I've outputted some geometrical points that I've created from this CSV that exists on my SharePoint site. So those are some 3 real-world examples of how you could use a SharePoint Online Connector in your workflow. And I'll hand it over to Matt.
Awesome, thanks, Jenna. So now we're going to look at how you can share these web connections, because a big benefit to creating a reusable web connection is sharing it. So if you only have FME form, there are some more primitive ways you can still share your web connections. The web service XML templates can be exported and imported in form. And you can also share the FME form connection storage file and public key on a network drive. And we have an article about how to do that. But certainly, and that's linked on the slide down below, but certainly FME Flow will give you many more options for sharing your web connections. So when you publish to FME Flow, you can do things like create deployment parameters. Anyone publishing workspaces up to Flow can use your connection provided they have access to it. So when you do publish a connection to Flow, you do need to share it, what we see on the screen here, so that others can access it and use it. So if you haven't published to Flow before, you can do that from FME Forum. You click the Publish button and connect. And when you're going through the Publish wizard in FME Forum, you'll be prompted to upload any connections that are used in your workspace. And this will actually upload the connection and also the underlying web service that's used by that connection to FME Flow, so long as they don't exist. If they already exist, then FME Flow, if both already exist, then FME Flow will let you know that at this step. If only the web service exists, it'll just upload the connection part of it. Let's see, and then, so for sharing web connections a little more, you want to make sure once you've uploaded them to FME Flow, that you don't forget to configure the web service on Flow. This is really for OAuth 2 web services. So in an OAuth 2 web service, you have to provide a redirect URL or an authorization URL, as it's called on the Flow interface. And it needs to be the FME Flow hostname / FME OAuth. So you need to add that after the web service has been published. You just want to make sure you've completed that step under connections and parameters, web connections, and Flow. So just to touch a little bit on deployment parameters, these are really your best option for sharing web connections now. They are new to FME 23. And what this is just a screenshot showing you what those deployment parameters look like in Flow. They're going to let you take a web connection that's been published to FME Flow, create a deployment parameter which lives on the Flow instance, and then you can use that name parameter in FME form. So just showing you a little bit more here how those work. On the right side of the slide, we'll see two FME Flow instances, say a test instance and a production instance. And we'll see some deployment parameters that have been created in each instance for ArcGIS portal, a connection, and a portal URL. And with different environments, those are often going to be different URLs and different connections required. So here we have a test ArcGIS portal that we've created the connection for on our FME Flow test instance, and then a production portal that we've created the connection for on our production instance. But because the names are the same, in FME form, you can just simply use that deployment parameter name. And then when you connect to these different Flow instances, your workflow will run using the appropriate connection for that environment. So they are quite powerful that way. Even if your organization only has one FME Flow instance, you don't have perhaps like dev, test, prod, they still provide a central place to add all of your web connections and then reference them via deployment parameters in FME form. So there are a lot of moving parts here. So we'll talk briefly about some troubleshooting. So just generally, generic troubleshooting tips. You want to verify your connection's been set up properly. Check you haven't skipped a step. You've added the right permissions, copied the correct values, etc. If you're seeing an error message, have you searched the internet for that error? So with web services, as we've shown in this webinar, you'll likely have to venture beyond the FME community into specific vendor websites and documentation. But certainly using search engines here are your friend. If things get really complicated, you can use web monitoring tools. So Fiddler is one, for example. There's also Wireshark that'll let you read more detailed error messages coming back from the web application you're trying to connect to. And of course, we want to look at log files. So in FME form, the desktop side, you can look at the translation log and you can get more details about what might be going wrong with your web connection by turning on log debug mode, which is found in FME options, translation options. And then once you've published your connection to Flow, if you're having problems there, you can check out logs like the FME OAuth log, which is found under service current. And we also have an FME connection log, which is found in the core log section. So specifically OAuth 2 connection errors, there's some pretty common ones like OAuth failed, invalid redirect URI. You want to check your web service settings on FME Flow to make sure that the client ID, secret, and redirect URL all match the values in the OAuth app. So just showing here, again, reiterating how important it is to configure that web service in FME Flow to get it to work correctly, providing the correct values from the application, in this example, SharePoint. More error codes. We don't have time to dive into all of these, but there's 401, 403, 404 errors. Again, the 401 means unauthorized. So try reauthorizing your web connection in Form or Flow. And if you can't authorize, make sure everything's configured correctly. You can try connecting to the REST API URLs outside of FME and see if you can hit those. There might be network issues that are preventing you from hitting the web application URLs. Certainly, if you start getting like 404 and timeouts where FME can't reach the web application URL, You want to check if you're behind a proxy. Proxies can often interfere with web connections. Has the proxy been configured correctly on the operating system and in FME form or flow where you're trying to make the connection? There could be firewall rules interfering. There's also HTTPS and SSL certificate errors. So you need to make sure, this is more on the flow side. So you want to make sure that your FME flow instance trusts the web application you're trying to connect to. You might need to import some SSL certificates to establish that trust. And try getting a token outside of FME using tools like Postman or curl. You can try hitting those token APIs and on the same machine that FME is installed on. And we can't go into every detail in the webinar, but we certainly have a ton of resources in the community. We have specific troubleshooting guides for popular web services, our web applications like SharePoint and ArcGIS Online that are linked on this slide. We also have like generic web connection troubleshooting guides as well. One common issue though that we do see a lot is the connection works fine on FME forum and then you publish it up to Flow and it's not working. It might work for a while on FME Flow and then you start receiving an invalid token error like the one on this slide. So again, like we mentioned at the start of the webinar, tokens have an expiry time. And when you publish a web service from form to Flow, that authentication token is actually published up to FME Flow with the web service, but it will expire and then Flow will need to go get a new one. And if the web service isn't configured right on FME Flow, it won't be able to do that and you'll get these errors. Another kind of more rare one we've seen is if you have different FME Flow instances like dev test prod, for example, you want to create different web connections for each instance. Some customers who try to use the same connection and then publish all their instances do run into problems sometimes with token invalidation. And again, if you're on Flow 23, using deployment parameters is great here because you can have those different web connections, one for each environment, and you can have the same named deployment parameter that you can reference in FME form. So just to conclude and summarize things, web connections let you reuse and share without hard coding web application credentials like your username and password. Web connection has underlying web service configuration. That's really where a lot of the guts and the configuration live. Web services use tokens to authenticate. And the key web service types we covered here are token and OAuth. FME provides web service templates for dozens of popular web applications. We saw a couple in the webinar today. And if we don't provide a web service template for the web app you're trying to connect to, go check the web app vendors documentation, see what they have, if anything. Most web application vendors now will have some way of authenticating and an API suite for you to use. So you can use that documentation to define your own web service template and connection. And like Jen showed, if you're motivated, we encourage you to share those on the FME Hub if one doesn't already exist. And now I'll just pass it back to Elizabeth for some conclusion, then we'll have a little bit of time for some Q&A.
Excellent, thanks, Matt. So as Matt mentioned, we have a lot of great resources on this topic to delve deeper in. So we'll have these linked on the slide here if you wish to download the deck. We'll also send that out in the follow-up email. Get our ebook, Spatial Data for the Enterprise. We have the short link there available. Webinars. We have tons of great upcoming webinars and on-demand content, safe.com/webinars. And our FME Academy has great learning experiences at your fingertips. So check out that link as well. Some next steps. If you are new to FME, we invite you to experience the FME Accelerator course. It will help you unlock the power of your data in just 90 minutes. And contact us if you would like to chat about anything data, info@safe.com. If you'd like to claim your community badge, I will drop that link in the chat as well. If you're not yet part of the FME community, we encourage you to check it out. It's a great place to network with other users and FME experts. And with that, we do have some time remaining for some Q&A here. So if you do have any questions, please get those into the questions panel. And we can take a look at that now. I'll invite Sienna and Matt on the stage. They'll be helping with Q&A today. Yeah, Matt, Sienna, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to elaborate on from the couple questions we did receive?
Yeah, so I was looking into, there's a question about SOAP APIs and digest authentication. Personally, not something I've worked with before. I did reach out to another support person here at Safe, and they said that they did think it was possible through the HTTPCaller, but I'll probably have to follow up with Hugh afterwards and just see what kind of resources we have on the community. Matt also found an article, not an article, a question where a person was able to authenticate using Python. Matt, have you worked with the SharePoint Online Connector?
Yes, I have. I'm just looking at that question now. It's related to something apparent from the past. Not that I know of. I believe that the connector connects to one folder, one document library at a time. I don't know of a way to select multiple, so you probably would need multiple transformers there. Oh, sorry, I'm just reading the question again. Without using multiple to download subfolders and multiple files within them. I haven't used it in a while. I might have to follow up on that one. But I would expect that there is a way to get the subfolders and files, but I'm not positive, to be honest. So I'll have to follow up on that one.
Awesome. All right. Any other notes we'd want to share this morning? Are we all good to wrap up?
I think we're good. Yeah, the rest of them I'll just have to follow up, unfortunately.
Yeah, some really specific questions. Randall's around BIM 360. Haven't used that one too much myself. I'm just looking at the SharePoint connector again, and it does look like there's an include subfolders option, Pemperoon. So I'm not sure if you've tried that and are still experiencing issues, but you should be able to use that option to get to do whatever you're doing with the SharePoint connector, like list, for example.
Excellent. All right. Well, just a huge thank you to everyone for joining us here today. If you do have a brief moment to fill out our webinar survey, we really appreciate any feedback. It's just a few multiple choice questions. And big thank you to Sienna and Matt for joining me on Q&A, and our presenters, of course, as well. Thanks, everyone, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.